Thank the Minister and recognize the member from Vancouver-Fairview.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And I will have a lot to say about this bill, as I have had in previous sessions of this Parliament. This in some ways defies belief that we're continuing on in this path with a referendum that appears arbitrary, that appears to be a one-off, that appears to hold Metro Vancouver mayors to a standard in terms of enhancing and increasing service, even just to meet the needs of population growth, in other words, steady state, a standard that no other capital project in British Columbia is being held to. And when I asked the Minister in estimates if there were plans to apply this referendum criterion to any other capital project, any other highway project, any other transit project within British Columbia, now or in the future, he said, no, this was an election promise. We're keeping this promise, which reaffirms to me, and I thank the Minister for reaffirming that what I and many others have always suspected, that this is in fact an arbitrary decision, a one-off decision to hold a referendum on Metro Vancouver transit in isolation from all other decisions being made on transportation, including a rather sudden announcement by the Premier at the last Union of BC Municipalities Convention that following a very quick consultation, a consultation which I hasten to add was not a referendum at all and was limited and had criteria that were perhaps not as expansive as others would have designed. She announced that the province would proceed with a bridge to replace the tunnel, currently called the Massey Tunnel, to cross the river at that point. It's a major project, but the Premier was unable to say whether it would be tolled. The Premier was unable to say whether the design for the bridge had been completed. The Premier was unable to say what the bridge would cost. All of these standards are standards that Metro mayors, the Mayor's Council, are being held to, but which this government won't even apply to its own initiatives or the initiatives of the Premier. So while I spoke some time ago about Bill 22, the changes to governance, and many of my colleagues spoke to the bill as well, and very thoughtful closing comments from my colleague from Vancouver Hastings, as well as other colleagues from Burnaby Deer Lake and Coquitlam Millardville and Surrey Wally and others. The fact remains that we see some good in that bill, although certainly we see some aspects that are seriously lacking and without which we question whether the bill can function effectively. In this bill, we see no merit whatsoever. We have said so from day one. Commentators have said so from day one. The mayors have said so from day one. And if that was all, if we simply disagreed with the premise, we'd simply be agreeing to disagree. But the consequences of not just the delay this year or last year in finding some way to carry forward with funding for Translink and allow the Mayor's Council to actually propose meaningful funding options for expanding bus service, for expanding rapid transit, for investing in infrastructure, for carrying out, in fact, the provincial government's own 2008 transit plan as it applies to Metro Vancouver. The ability to move forward in a reasonable manner to prevent congestion, to prevent the cost to the economy of prevention of congestion, to prevent the serious impacts on family life and livability in the region by not actually moving ahead now and approving funding sources now to move on with enhancing transit services in the Lower Mainland, even to the point of keeping up with the level of customized transit for people with mobility issues known as HandyDART, even to the point of keeping up with plans that were part of base plan to enhance bus service and increase bus service, to increase C-bus service. None of this is possible. We're not just talking about infrastructure or capital plans or light rail or subways. We're talking about simply keeping up with population growth in the Lower Mainland region, and this continual delay in approving methods of funding simply has become intolerable for people of the Lower Mainland. So with that, let me talk a little bit about some of the history of this government with respect to Translink and funding of transit in the Metro Vancouver region. First of all, I mentioned the 2008 Provincial Transit Plan. That plan had very ambitious ridership. It was talking about doubling transit ridership and reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 4.7 million tons by 2020, and a significant part of this was by investing in transit in Metro Vancouver. That was the plan in 2008. What have we seen since then? With minister after minister, with premier after premier, with delay after delay. We've seen, for starters, a 3-year delay in the Evergreen Line and massive service cuts to bus routes, especially south of the Fraser. And those service cuts, my friends at Translink say, we haven't cut service, we just haven't expanded the way we plan to. But I think we all know, Honourable Speaker, that if population is going up, if congestion is going up, and we actually don't expand bus service to meet that growing demand, that's effectively a cut to the availability of transportation for people who rely on it. And when another mechanism relied on by Translink, and that is called service optimization, that's moving buses from lesser used routes to more heavily used routes, is implemented, that's also experienced as a cut by many of the people who use the lesser used routes. Now, it is true that the demand may be higher in the other places, but it's also true that it is an impact, and perhaps an unnecessary impact, on those people on the lesser used routes. So, we had the 2008 Provincial Transit Plan, and then in 2010, to much fanfare, the province and the mayors signed a regional transportation agreement. There was a news release dated September 23, 2010. And let me just read some quotes from various people who were involved in that initiative. And what the Premier of the day, Gordon Campbell, said, and I quote, "Today we are reaffirming our commitment to the people of Metro Vancouver that their mayors and the provincial government will collaborate closely to keep people, goods, and services moving quickly and efficiently with minimal impact on our environment." The province and the Mayor's Council, the release goes on to say, commit to the development of a long-term sustainable funding strategy that makes the most of Translink's available revenue sources, as well as finding innovative ways to generate revenue, such as using the increase in property values along rapid transit corridors to support future projects. The current Minister of Jobs and then Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure said, and I quote again, "Together we're creating a transportation system that encourages people to take transit rather than drive their cars, leading to less traffic congestion and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. An efficient, affordable, and reliable public transportation system is an essential component of a livable region." That's the statement of the then Transportation and Infrastructure Minister, the current Jobs Minister. The current Minister of Education and then Mayor of the City of Langley said, "This agreement forms the foundation of a new dialogue to sustainably plan, fund, and deliver a world-class transportation system to the region." And as I've said, the news release said that this MOU will help support the region and Translink to expand services and infrastructure to meet the provincial transit plan goals, which had been developed 2 years earlier, a strategy to double transit ridership and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 4.7 million tons, all by 2020. Well, that announcement was worthy of some kudos and some congratulations. The only problem is that it's now 4 years, almost 4 years after that announcement, almost 6 years after the provincial transit plan, and we're still in gridlock on funding. And the result of the gridlock on funding, there's a lot of causes of that gridlock, and it's been repeated over time, and I'll detail some of this. But the most recent one was a surprise thrown to all of us from the Premier of British Columbia that any increase in funding for Translink to enhance service, to build new infrastructure, or even to keep up with a growing population, even to provide the current level of service, would have to go to a referendum. This caused loggerheads to develop between the government, the new minister, the Premier, and the Mayor's Council on Translink. Translink immediately suspended parts of planned expansion in their base plan and supplemental plan. 306,000 hours of additional bus service that were planned just to keep up with current demand and a growing population were put on the scrap heap. Were put on the scrap heap, Honourable Speaker, because Translink believed that it would be irresponsible to go forward with that plan without the funding to pay for it, even as they were continuing to provide service by eating into their reserves at a rate that many people believed was completely unsustainable. Honourable Speaker, this is not the way to do transit planning. Yes, there are hard decisions to make about priorities. Yes, the public never holds up their hand and voluntarily says, we're ready to give you more money, unless it's clearly explained to them what that additional money is for. And I believe, I know certainly my constituents in Vancouver-Fairview, the constituents of my colleagues on this side of the House for constituencies in Metro Vancouver, and the constituents represented by members opposite know that congestion's a problem. They want to see it solved. Not everybody will be able to take transit, but certainly people who are able to take convenient transit, accessible transit, and affordable transit are likely to do so if it gets them to where they need to be on a timely basis. That in turn will free up the highways and roadways for other commuters who have no choice but to take a car. It will free up highways and roadways for service people, and most importantly, well, I won't say most importantly, but very importantly, it will free up the roads to allow the transport of goods much more quickly throughout the region and to port, and those goods come from all over the province. Honourable Speaker, I was at a conference where the Mayor of Surrey put forward a figure that the cost of congestion to the economy of the entire province of BC is estimated to be up to $1.5 billion annually. That's a lot of lost productivity. That's a lot of lost economic activity. We don't want to see that on this side of the House. I'm sure the members opposite don't want to see it. I know that people in resource communities and people who are operating resource industries around the province don't want to see that. There has to be a better way. We are stuck, I guess, with this system because the members opposite have a majority, and they're certainly committed to carrying out this proposal. And the minister said that the mayors appear to be taking up the challenge in good faith to work on a question and to work on a system of priorities. And of course they are, Honourable Speaker, because if you took any of us, locked us in a box and said the only way out is through that door, here's the saw, cut your way out, we'd be sawing away, even if it was a very thick wall, because it's the only way out. So yes, the mayors are working hard, and they're working in good faith, but the mayors, frankly, have put forward numerous funding options over many years, most of which have been rejected by successive ministers, successive premiers, successive governments. across the aisle, and it's just not good enough. It's not good enough in 2008 to create a transit plan and say you're committed to it, and you're committed to its goals, and you're committed to doubling the ridership, and you're committed to a very significant reduction in greenhouse gases. It's not good enough to say in 2010, in a joint release with mayors that they entered into in good faith, that you're going to sit down and work out funding formula with them and consider in good faith how to fund the system, and then not do it. Not only not do it, but every time a suggestion is brought forward, to dump cold water on it, while at the same time having removed them from an important oversight role and a governance role and a policy-making role. It's not good enough to undercut successive transportation ministers who negotiate agreements with mayors, and then to have the leader of the government turn around and turn her back on them and undercut the transportation minister of the day, or as some of us and some media wags like to call it, throw another transportation minister under the bus. It's not good enough because there are real impacts on people, there are real impacts on family, there's real impacts on the economy. It's not good enough. So what we have is a 2008 transit plan with lofty ambitions. We have a 2010 agreement to work with mayors to expedite funding the system and finding new ways of funding the needed transit expansion. The memorandum talks about it as needed transit expansion and an efficient, affordable, and reliable public transportation system, which was understood to be an essential component of a livable region. So what do we have? Back then, it had a $14 billion price tag. We called it an unfunded wish list at that time on this side of the House because it wasn't funded, and unfunded it remains, Honourable Speaker. But it's an honourable wish list. It's the right wish list. It's the right aspirations and goals for both the province and the mayors and Translink. It meshes with the residents of Metro Vancouver and their vision of a livable region, their vision of being able to move around in a livable region. It meshes with the desire of people engaged in the movement of goods and services around the province and around the region to do that in an efficient, cost-effective, and productive way, and yet, unfunded it remains. So let's take a look at some of the timeline of events to do with funding. 2009, the government ordered the Comptroller General to conduct a review of Translink, which faced a $130 million funding shortfall and could not afford its share of the Evergreen Line. The review recommends cost containment before any new funding sources. Translink followed the recommendations and passed the 2009 Funding Stabilization Plan. To maximize its existing revenue sources, it increased tax and parking, was looking at property taxes, transit fares, but this only closed the operating funding shortfall and provided no new services. And at that time, Translink still didn't have enough for its share of the Evergreen Line. 2010, as I mentioned, the province and the Translink mayors signed the Regional Transportation Agreement to find sustainable funding sources. Great document, lots of agreement. People were hopeful. People thought they could go forward and solve the problem, because we all know it takes a considerable amount of time to order and construct rapid transit, whether it's SkyTrain or light rail. It takes not as much time, but a significant amount of time to order and have produced new buses and to train the mechanics and drivers for those buses. All of this takes time. So if you don't start, if you don't have an assurance of funding, the time frame just stretches out and you start falling further and further behind, which is exactly what's happening to us today. On July 6, then Transportation Minister, July 6, 2011, then Transportation Minister Blair Leckstrom announced that a deal had been struck with regional mayors to increase the fuel tax in Metro Vancouver to pay for the long-delayed Evergreen Line. And what happened 5 days later? Honorable Speaker, the Premier of the province announced in one of her patented surprise announcements for transportation ministers that she did not support the minister's deal with the mayors because it was unaffordable. Now, the minister had spent a significant amount of time and political capital in making this deal with the mayors, and God knows, Honorable Speaker, what was actually said when they met in a room finally, but 2 days later, the Premier recanted and agreed to support the deal that had been made between the mayors and the transportation minister. She even wrote a letter to the Mayor's Council Chair Richard Walton to seal the deal. My colleague, the then transportation critic, called it at the time policy on the go. Well, Honorable Speaker, at least she reversed herself at that time and allowed the significant agreement that had been reached between the minister and the mayors to go forward. So somewhat later in the fall, 2011, the mayors passed what's known as the Moving Forward 2012 Supplemental Plan to fund various transportation projects in the Metro Vancouver region, including the Evergreen Line. Funding would be provided in part by a 2 cents per litre increase in the Metro fuel tax. In March 2012, the mayors then sent a letter, and I've referenced this. They then sent a letter to Minister Lekstrom with additional funding proposals. These included a graduated vehicle registration fee, otherwise known as a vehicle levy, a regional carbon tax, road pricing, and an additional fuel tax. At that point, a by-election was being kicked off in Port Moody, and the Premier simply rejected the idea of a vehicle levy and called for Translink's shortfall, their $30 million shortfall, to be made up by an audit. Now, it's fair enough to have an audit. It's fair enough to have audits periodically, but unfortunately, the Premier's rejection of the Mayor's proposal triggered a temporary $28 million region-wide property tax. And further, the audit that the Premier was promoting for Translink, while she said that there had been an audit at BC Hydro and it had resulted in significant savings and therefore would be a good model for Translink, the fact remains that it was the third such audit in as many years. Now, there's only so many times you can keep going back and doing an audit and assuming that, oh, magically, whoever did the last audit 12 months ago missed a whole big pot of money that we're now going to find, and somehow magically we'll be able to enhance Translink services with it. So let's talk about what was found by that audit. So we know the Premier had ruled out the vehicle levy, and the then Minister Lekstrom admitted that he and the Premier, as he said, had not collaborated on a talk, but he did say, "She is my Premier. I serve in the Cabinet at her discretion," which of course is true of all ministers. This was in the Globe and Mail. It is perhaps noteworthy, and the now Minister of Education may want to remember what then Minister Lekstrom said, but at the time the Minister of Education was the Mayor of Langley and Vice Chair of the Translink Mayor's Council, and he said the Premier seems to be drawing a line in the sand. Now clearly, I've heard the Minister of Education speak to the earlier bill today and praise it, and I have praised parts of it as well, but I'd ask the Minister to remember that there was a time when, as a local government elected official, he believed that the actions of the Premier were not conducive to reaching agreement and cooperation between the mayors and the provincial government on the necessary funding. He went on to say, "She has never talked to me or Mayor Walton, the chair of the Mayor's Council, nor does she seem to have talked to her own cabinet members. I'm never surprised at things the Premier says. I think she makes decisions in isolation." Well, a long list of transportation ministers have in fact had to deal with a Premier who, when faced with a microphone, seems to say whatever she thinks is appropriate at the time, which has the effect, of course, of undermining the legitimate undertakings and actions of her ministers in trying to, in good faith, reach agreement with other levels of government. On April 17th, 2012, Translink CEO Ian Jarvis announced that all future expansion projects are on hold until the financing issue is resolved. The Evergreen line was the exception because a 2% gas tax had been allocated to that. On September 5th, Blair Leckstrom was replaced as Transportation Minister. I guess he disagreed with the Premier one too many times by the current Minister of the Environment. In September again, Translink released their 2013 base plan, and despite aggressive cost cutting, Translink then faced a $472 million shortfall between 2013 and 2015 and had to cancel the following plans. There was a planned increase of 306,000 annual service hours, as I've mentioned earlier, that was necessary to reduce overcrowding on key routes, to accommodate population growth, and to meet the UPass demand. They canceled until funding could be found and assured full Highway 1 rapid bus project. They canceled the full King George Boulevard B-line to White Rock. They canceled a third C-bus that was planned to extend C-bus service to every 15 minutes with an upgrade to the Lonsdale Quay. And they canceled, in addition, full funding for major road network and cycling upgrades. Now, all of this was supposed to have been dealt with by an audit. If only an audit could find enough funding for Translink to go forward with the identified service enhancements, I will add again, that were necessary to keep up with population growth. In October, the Translink audit was released. Excuse me. And the Premier claimed it found $41 million in savings. However, if you dug a little deeper, only $11 million was actually identified as savings. Now, I don't want to pretend that $11 million isn't a very significant amount of money.
Are you a designated speaker?
I am indeed the designated speaker, Honorable Speaker. So I may continue. Thank you. Let me restate this. So only $11 million was identified as real savings. And $11 million is a lot of money, but in the context of what Translink needs in order to simply meet existing service levels, whether it's for customized transit for people with mobility challenges, whether it's for people in suburbs, or whether it's planning for the needed expansion of transit south of the Fraser, rapid transit, rapid bus, dealing with the most congested corridor in North America on Broadway, which the city of Vancouver is desperately trying to address in some form or other. All of these things take considerably more than $11 million. $30 million of the $41 million in savings that was identified by the Premier as a result of the audit were not actually savings at all, Honourable Speaker. They resulted from applying a less conservative budgeting method and eating into Translink's reserves, something that then Translink Chair Nancy Ohlweiler termed irresponsible. There is, in fact, a level below which the reserves should never go. But simply eating into reserves to cover operating costs because Translink is not being adequately funded is a deep mistake. It puts the future of the organization at some risk, and to call it an audit-found saving or efficiency is simply incorrect, misleading, and should never have been said. March 1st, Translink makes up the temporary repealing of the $30 million property tax by changing 34 bus routes, which it terms service optimization. I've acknowledged that some routes are more heavily used and they certainly shouldn't suffer, but if the funding level was appropriate, then it would be easier to determine which service optimization suggestions and methods actually made sense and did not significantly lessen service to people unfortunate enough to live somewhere with a slightly lesser served route in order to enhance and optimize service for the more heavily traveled routes. This is the kind of measure that Translink will call service optimization, but the people who are impacted will call a service cut. March 22nd, the governance review we talked about, and which the member opposite, in I think goodwill but incorrectly identified as a governance review that was commissioned in support of Bill 22. It was actually commissioned quite some time ago at the end of 2012. It was commissioned by the Mayor's Council to review the governance, and I won't go over it in too much detail, but as I noted in the debate on Bill 22, the report found that the governance structure at Translink introduced by this minister's predecessor, several ministers removed, was unique in the world, quote, unique in the world and not in a good way. Accountability to the population being served is almost completely missing from the present arrangement. April 8th, the government announced it would create a working group with regional mayors to look at sustainable funding sources for Metro Vancouver Transit. Now, this is nearly 3 years after the parties signed a deal to do so in September 2010, when Gordon Campbell was the Premier of the province. 3 years of no action on a widely announced initiative between this provincial government and the mayors in order to put into effect the province's own 2008 transit plan and to meet the needs of the people in Metro Vancouver. So, the working group is set up and is scheduled to come up with recommendations to allow the province to introduce legislative changes by spring 2014. It was supposed to make recommendations by the end of September. Well, Honourable Speaker, it is spring 2014, and we're debating legislation on a referendum that may not happen for another year, at which point, if it passes, Translink will then be waiting for this government to call the House to session and pass whatever enabling legislation is necessary in order to find new funding sources to make up for the shortfall in service to a growing population in Metro Vancouver and to invest and plan for infrastructure, whether it's new buses, light rail, or subways, to meet the demands of the future. And in the meantime, Honourable Speaker, Translink's own figures show that at this current rate of funding, that by the year 2020, if you consider service on a per capita basis, because of the growing population in Metro Vancouver, by the year 2020, service levels will have regressed to where they were in 2004. How on earth, Honourable Speaker, does that meet the 2008 transit plan of this government or the Livable Regions strategy put together by the democratically elected mayors and councillors of the Metro Vancouver region? The answer is it does not. We're in policy gridlock here. Nothing has happened. Promises were made that were not kept. Nothing continues to happen. And why? Because every time the mayors suggest a funding solution, a premier says no. Every time a transportation minister enters into good faith to try to solve the funding problem or makes a deal with the mayors, a premier says no. And in the worst case scenario, the minister is thrown under the bus. So here we are with an off-the-cuff election promise to have a referendum that is holding up progress on meeting the transportation needs of the people of the Lower Mainland and the economic needs of the entire province of British Columbia. The number of times of years that nothing has happened, multiplied by 1.5 billion, could pay for much of the improvements that are needed in service, in infrastructure, in buses, in trains, in subway cars, in SkyTrain cars. All of this could have been happening if there was some leadership from the government on the transportation issue, instead of ducking and looking for cover under a so-called democratic initiative like a referendum that may happen sometime in the future, and where, in fact, Honourable Speaker, it is a measure and a requirement that the minister himself has said will be applied to no other transportation infrastructure or highway or project in British Columbia. In other words, the Premier wrote it on the back of a napkin. She promised it in an election. She stuck it in the platform, and they're single-mindedly proceeding to disadvantage the entire Metro Vancouver region on a plan to hold a referendum that nobody wanted, nobody supports, and we on this side of the House will not support. It defies the imagination, Honourable Speaker, that a Premier can promise a referendum on Translink funding while throwing out an unplanned, unfunded, undesigned promise for a new bridge that is questionable and that will likely cause gridlock at either end because it is not integrated into an overall regional transportation strategy. It's not good enough. Let me continue, Honourable Speaker, with the chronology. September 2013, Premier Clark comments on the referendum, and she says, "The Translink referendum is something that needs to be resolved by mayors. They need to come together with a proposal. They need to agree on it, and then we can put that forward to the public." Honourable Speaker, that's an incredible statement from a Premier who forces a referendum on mayors that they never asked for in the first place and that they don't support. All of a sudden, the delay is the fault of the mayors because they haven't crafted the question. So if we look at Bill 23, Honourable Speaker, closely, does it say that the mayors get to craft the question? No. It says they get to make recommendations on the question. It's still the government that will decide the question. So what is it, Honourable Speaker? Is it the mayor's fault and their responsibility, or is it the government's fault and the government's responsibility? I think, Honourable Speaker, the answer is in the legislation, and it's not a very good or very satisfactory answer. In response to the Premier, the Mayor of Richmond, Malcolm Brodie, said, and he, I believe, reflected the sentiment of mayors across the region, and I quote, "The Premier came up with the idea of a referendum. It's her idea. It's up to the government to formulate the questions. From my point of view, it is up to the government to stage the referendum, and they are responsible for the results." So on the one hand, you have the government, the minister, and the Premier saying it is the responsibility of the mayors to design the question, that they're the holdup, that they need to come up with the priorities, they need to find the wording of the question, notwithstanding the fact that there has been plenty of back and forth between the transportation minister and the Premier about whether it'll be a multiple choice question, whether it'll be a yes and no question, whether the government will support the referendum, whether the government will keep hands off the referendum. There's not widespread agreement, even on that side of the House, Honourable Speaker, about exactly what this looks like. Nonetheless, it is the responsibility of the mayors to read the collective minds of the government and come up with a question which the legislation tells us can only be in the form of a recommendation, so they better guess right. November 23rd. We're getting close to today, Honourable Speaker. November 23rd, the Transportation Minister tells Vaughn Palmer, with respect to the referendum question, it cannot be a convoluted question with a whole bunch of boxes to tick off and so forth. The successful referendums tend to be yes, no, one single question at the bottom. In terms of timing, we want to maximize voter participation, we want to minimize the cost of the referendum, and we want to set the referendum up for the maximum chance of success." End quote. Now, Honourable Speaker, while it may not always be apparent when I speak, I have a fair amount of respect for the Transportation Minister, and I believe he meant exactly what he said. I've said, and he obviously won't agree with me in this House or in public, that he's making the best of a bad idea that wasn't his, but nonetheless, he understands the need for transit. He understands, he's done his research, he's looked at referenda around North America, I've listened to him, I've read his comments, he understands what was successful and what wasn't, and he stated that in the interview with Mr. Palmer, and he also made his own commitment to try his best to ensure the success of the referendum, because I think his implication was, we're having a referendum, we made the commitment to have a referendum, it was in the platform, it's a promise, so we're going to keep it. I may not have thought of it, but we're going to keep it. But he does understand the necessity of the referendum passing. So he said that. So what happens after that? While the minister committed to fighting for a successful result, and he said the Premier did not make this commitment to just run through a process, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, whatever, and we'll move on, but we're committed to success. The minister said, we are committed to success. I, as the minister, am committed to success on this referendum. It's a steep hill to climb to get there, no question about it. Now, I commend the minister for showing his commitment at that time. This particular interview was printed in the Vancouver Sun on November 23rd. So what happens December 13th? The Premier has an interview with the Globe and Mail. And does she back up the Transportation Minister? Does she show the commitment to success in the referendum that the Transportation Minister had referenced in his interview with Vaughn Palmer? Well, let's see what the Premier said, and I'll let you judge for yourself, Honourable Speaker. While the Transportation Minister said, following significant research, research that I'm sure the Premier did not have time to do herself personally, that the most successful referenda tended to be yes-no, the Premier said it needs to be a multiple choice question. A simple yes or no doesn't do justice to the questions that are there. We really want to ask people, how much transit do you want? How much do you want to pay for it? How much change do you want? Or do you want no change to the system at all? Well, Honourable Speaker, I'll let I'll let members on this side of the House, I'll let members on opposite, and I'll let the public themselves decide whether there's a congruency between the comments of the Minister of Transportation and the commitment of the Minister of Transportation to a successful referendum, and the comments of the Premier following his comments, of which I would hope she would be aware, that effectively contradicted him and effectively threw him under one of the dwindling number of buses in the Lower Mainland. Honourable Speaker, the other thing the Premier didn't mention was, as I have said, the significant impact on the economy of continued congestion in the Lower Mainland. This isn't about people simply, oh, it'd be nice to have a few more buses. We really like those SkyTrains and we'd like to see more of them. We'd really like a faster way to get out to UBC. It's about the incredible congestion south of the Fraser, the incredible congestion that's been caused by people choosing the Tunnel Bridge and streaming into New Westminster, the incredible congestion along the Broadway corridor, the incredible congestion other places where the provision of new technologies, rapid transit, whether it's rapid bus, light rail, subway, SkyTrain, or simply adding more buses to existing routes or adding more sea buses to cross from the North Shore to the downtown of Vancouver, actually get cars off the road and allow goods and services to move. No, the Premier didn't reference that. I would hope the Premier would know about it, because members opposite continually remind us that they know about the economy and we don't. They know about the economy and we don't understand it. They're committed to growing the economy and we're not. Honourable Speaker, I reject that assertion. Absolutely, it's not true. We do understand the economy. We are committed to growing it in a responsible, sustainable way. And part of that is ensuring that there's necessary transit in Metro Vancouver to get cars off the road, to get people to where they're going, to allow goods and services to move, and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if the Premier doesn't get it, we get it on this side of the House, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, the Premier went on to say, just in case she thought the bus should back up over the Transportation Minister, that the people will decide. People will need to do their homework to make sure they get the answer that is right for them. I'm not sure if the Premier thought when she said that as they're driving, stuck in traffic because there isn't accessible and affordable rapid transit that they can take as they're in their car, not using their cell phones because that's now illegal. They're actually reading the details of the cost of enhanced transit with one hand, driving with the other, hoping to get home in time for dinner while they plan how they're going to vote on the referendum. People will need to do their homework to make sure they get the answer that is right for them, but I'm not going to try to decide for people what their answer should be. Unlike, I might add, the new bridge to replace the Massey Tunnel, the Premier said, I am not going to try to decide for people what their answer should be. Well, of course, she won't be deciding in a referendum, but a little bit of leadership would be nice. A little bit of honesty. The Transportation Minister, at least, notwithstanding the fact that I disagree on Bill 23, intends to show some leadership on this particular issue because he does understand that Translink is underfunded. Honourable Speaker, it is difficult to understand what sort of conversations must happen between the Premier and the Transportation Minister. Because Mr. Stone has in fact, the Transportation Minister has in fact made it clear on a number of occasions that he believes that this referendum should succeed and he's prepared to put his own political capital on the table for it. And I will commend him for that. He understands that it's important for government to show leadership. And if we ever end up with a referendum, if and when we ever end up with a referendum, if the people of Metro Vancouver are given a chance to finally take some action, whether it's in 2014 or 2015, to approve a funding model that's now 4 years overdue, and by then will be 5 years overdue, and some would argue is actually 7 years overdue, that the government will understand that leadership is needed to talk about all of the real choices. It's not a zero-sum game, Honourable Speaker. It's not just a question of spending money for nothing. It's a question of spending money to enhance transportation, to enhance livability, and to support the economy. We know that. I believe the Transportation Minister knows that. It's important that people understand that if they don't pay for transit, they will be paying in a myriad of other ways and likely be paying far more long-term. Finally, January 27th of this year, I knew I'd eventually get into 2014, the Premier once again said that the responsibility was the Mayor's responsibility. They're the ones that will have to lead the debate. We're enabling it as a province. We're enabling the people of the province, the citizens of the Lower Mainland, to vote on it, but it's ultimately the mayors that are going to have to lead it. Honourable Speaker, if the Premier meant those words, the Premier would not have said no on numerous occasions to funding solutions put forward in good faith so many times over the past several years by the mayors. She simply would not have done that, because the end result of doing that has been a delay. The end result for people with mobility challenges has been an unbelievably high increase in the number of service denials by HandyDart. An incredible increase over the last 7 years. A huge percentage increase, Honourable Speaker. These are people who are effectively being kept hostage in their own house because the funding to increase handy-dart service has not been available from Translink, because Translink doesn't have enough funding for handy-dart. It didn't have enough funding to put 306,000 more service hours in place to meet the demand of a growing population. It couldn't keep the promise of a previous transportation minister to add a third C-bus to the route. So there'd be 3 C-buses, so there'd be a C-bus every 10 minutes at peak times. There's any number of things that haven't been done. And Honourable Speaker, this is all a problem. So to begin to sum up, Honourable Speaker, despite aggressively cutting costs, Translink faces a $472 million shortfall between 2013 and 2015. 2015 looks like it may be the date that a referendum will be held under this legislation. That's a long time. Following the passage of a referendum, assuming it passes, it will take a considerable amount of time for buses to be ordered. It takes a little over a year for a bus to be ordered and delivered. It takes 5 to 7 years for a SkyTrain to be ordered, produced, and delivered, and the infrastructure built. I believe it's somewhat less for light rail. I think it's something like 3 to 5 years. This all takes time. If the government had met its commitment under the memorandum of agreement that was signed on September 23, 2010, we'd be approaching a time when much of this infrastructure would be about to be delivered. People would have been hired, people would have been trained, more buses would already be on the road. Translink would have the funding necessary to not only keep up with population, but to keep up with the growing demand. People with mobility challenges would not be forced into a situation where even with a week's notice, they can't get the ride they need to see their doctor, or they're told that after their doctor's appointment, they will have to wait for 3 hours, up to 3 hours, to get a ride home. Translink would not be forced to offer taxis, which are okay in suitable situations, but are not okay in so many others, when taxi drivers have nowhere near the level of training or expertise in understanding the needs of the many people who are served by handy-dart. All of these things could have been avoided. All of these things, if the government had met the terms of its memorandum and met with the mayors in good faith, accepted some of their proposals for funding, the government's own 2008 transportation plan could be taking life today instead of gathering dust on a shelf while Metro Vancouver commuters gather dust as they wait at bus stops while buses pass them by. Honourable Speaker, we could have done better. We should have done better. 306,000 annual service hours that were needed to reduce overcrowding, that were needed to keep up with the UPass program, cut. Cut, because Translink had no assurance of funding. Honourable Speaker, the Highway 1 Rapid Bus Project, on the shelf. The King George Boulevard beeline to White Rock, out the window. The extension of C-bus service, nowhere to be seen. The minister talks about a third bus, but it's not going to be an additional bus. That's what's not being said in this House. And full funding for the major road network and cycling upgrades, nowhere to be seen. Honourable Speaker, at this rate, as I've said previously, by 2020, service levels on a per capita basis will be back to 2004 levels. How is that meeting the government's own 2008 transit plan, which wanted to double ridership, double transit ridership, and reduce GHG emissions by 4.7 million tons? The answer is that it does not. South of the Fraser in Surrey, people are completely frustrated. The Mayor of Surrey went to the federal government on her own to seek funding to increase transit and rapid transit in Surrey. Steve Burke, the president of the Surrey Citizens Transportation Initiative, said that route adjustments will mean fewer buses on many routes and longer wait times. Route adjustments. Another word for service optimization, which the people of Surrey experience as cuts. Steve Burke went on to say, we have about one bus for about 4,000 Surrey residents when the metro average is about one for 1,700, and Vancouver is probably closer to one for 1,500. So why should the people south of the Fraser continue to be disadvantaged, Honourable Speaker, when even in Vancouver and the rest of the region we know that service is not keeping up with the growth of the population? Honourable Speaker, there seems to be no end to this. I mean, I guess a bill to introduce a referendum that's been talked about for the last year is some form of, I hesitate to use the word progress, I hesitate to use the word moving forward, because that was the word used for the Metro Mayor's Council transportation plan, and clearly this referendum idea doesn't support that, nor does the lack of funding support it. But I guess it's better than talking about it. But the fact remains that it doesn't fund even the current needs, let alone the future needs. It doesn't get people into transit and out of cars. It doesn't allow goods and services to move more quickly through the region. It doesn't allow any of that. Instead, Honourable Speaker, it just puts off the inevitable for political expediency, and that's not, Honourable Speaker, in my view, what we were elected to do. We were elected to understand the needs of the people we serve. We were elected to support locally elected officials who are completely accountable for that. We were elected to address congestion on the roads, the effect on the economy, livability in the region, the needs of working people to cut a precious few half hours off their commutes every day or every week in order to spend more time with their family, the needs of people who work shift work, food service workers, people who work in hotels, people who work in the health industry, who travel at odd times of the day to not have to sit around in potentially dangerous SkyTrain stations or bus stops waiting for buses that may never come or may not come for another hour, to wait when SkyTrain service is far more sparse than when it is at the normally considered rush hour or peak times. Honourable Speaker, we were elected to serve everyone. This government is government to serve the needs of everyone, and hiding behind a referendum because it was politically expedient in an election campaign is not good enough. It's not good enough for British Columbians. It's not good enough for the economy. It's not good enough for the people of Metro Vancouver, and it's disrespectful. It's disrespectful to the elected officials who, in good faith, signed a memorandum of agreement in 2010 with this government, where the government committed to sit down and talk about new funding sources that were needed to expand transportation options, and instead the government cut and run, and it did not matter what any transportation minister said or did or what deal they worked out with the mayors or however hard they tried to make a difference. The Premier threw them under the bus. Honourable Speaker, excuse me. Honourable Speaker, what did the Premier No, I'm losing my voice. Honourable Speaker, what did the Premier say? Previous to this referendum idea were her ideas about referendums on tax issues. Well, in 2011, she said, I never thought that tax issues are best outside the legislature. Again, in 2011, she said, and this was a press release, I think you have to be upfront with people. You have to explain the circumstances. You have to have a debate, and then you introduce your tax policy. I will lead a government that consults, listens, and then acts with the best interest of all British Columbians at heart. When you do that, people are willing to accept changes to the tax system. Honourable Speaker, that must have been a different premier than the one who has proposed this referendum and the one who is forcing this referendum on the people of Metro Vancouver. Because, as the minister himself confirmed in estimates, there are no other plans for future referenda except for Translink. Not for the bridge to replace the Massey Tunnel, not for highway projects, not for transit elsewhere in the province, not for road improvements, not for anything else. The minister confirmed that this was an election promise and it was going to be kept. In other words, it's an arbitrary, one-off move. Let me quote the then Transportation Minister and the current Environment Minister one more time. Even after the Liberal platform was released, the then Transportation Minister said that voters will not be able to reject any and all new taxes or fees for Translink in a referendum. She said that none of the above will be an option. Sorry, none of the above will not be an option. She said that, Honourable Speaker, because she understood that none of the above is not a practical option for solving the transportation needs of the Lower Mainland. And what did the Premier do 2 days after that? She contradicted her Transportation Minister by saying, if voters don't want it, we're not going to impose it on them. After the election, the Minister of the Environment once again said that there would be choices, not simply a yes or no. She said that she thought that voters would choose the best means of going forward and funding their transit future, and the referendum is to take place related to the choice of funding, not whether there needs to be funding, recognizing that there needs to be expansion and maintenance of service. Now, one might wonder why the Environment Minister was speaking on the referendum when she was no longer Environment Minister, but of course, the availability of transit, getting cars off the road, even by the government's own transportation plan, the goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 4.7 million tons, is of important and critical concern to the Environment Minister. So, what did the Premier do? Once again, she said, it's up to the mayors. It's up to the mayors. It's up to the mayors to come together, step up to the table, and come up with the question. This was in response to many people questioning why we continue to have delay and confusion and disagreement between ministers and the Premier over what the referendum would look like, how it would take place, when it would take place, who would pay for it, whether or not the government would be involved in supporting it. This prompted Gary Mason of the Globe and Mail to say that the Premier and her Transportation Minister need to get on the same page. Need to get on the same page. Honourable Speaker, I would say that the government needs to get on the same page with its own commitments, its own signed memorandum of agreement with the Metro Vancouver Mayor's Council, and meet the promise that they made almost 4 years ago to agree on funding options for Translink, scrap this referendum idea, and get on with it, because everybody knows that it needs to be done. Let me simply read some other comments from commentators. Kim Emerson on News 1130, December 14, 2013. He says, and I quote, "Here's the kick I get out of it. She's looking more and acting more like Bill Vander Zalm when he was Premier these days than the leader who is actually in charge and directing what's happening." This was in response to the continual disagreement between the Minister of Transportation and the Premier on the form of the question and whether the government would get involved and whether it would be a yes or no question or whether it would be a list of options. Honourable Speaker, I've gone on at considerable length as the designated speaker about what the problems are with the delay in reaching agreement with the mayors and funding transit. Translink is trying to maintain service levels, and clearly Translink will not be able to do that until it's assured of funding. We will see a continuing decrease of per capita service levels projected to reach 2004 levels by 2020. This will force more people to buy cars, and once people buy cars, they're committed to driving them. This is not how we are going to get more people into transit, Honourable Speaker. It is not how we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Buses may have to be cut in growing areas. I spoke earlier today on Bill 22 about the mayor of Coquitlam speaking about the problem in new developments that were planned around the expansion of transit that never happened, and how the people who bought in those new developments are now turning away from a transit-oriented community and turning it into a car-oriented community. More and more of this will happen the longer and longer we wait to make a commitment to increasing transit in the region. We know what the problems in the Broadway corridor are. It is the most stressed route in North America. The buses are full. People stand and are passed up by the 99B line constantly. It will take a long time before any infrastructure can be built, and it will take a longer time if we don't start now. People south of the Fraser currently don't have the same level of transit service as people throughout the region, and particularly in Vancouver. This should be of concern to all of us, Honourable Speaker, and yet the people south of the Fraser are being told they will have to wait longer and longer and longer before their needed and promised projects, the projects that were scheduled to go ahead, until Translink was forced to scale them back because they were already in deficit, they were eating into their reserves, and there was no funding for them. All future expansion is on hold. It takes 18 months from tender to buy a bus and to train operators. Light rail takes 5 years, a subway takes 6 years. There are federal funds available for matching that are dependent on commitments from Translink to put funds forward. All of this, Honourable Speaker, is at risk while we wait for a decision in a referendum that no one asked for other than the Premier. All of this is at risk while the government refuses to exercise leadership and a policy mandate and meet with the mayors and agree on funding of expansion of rapid transit and provision of the needed expansion of existing services to meet up with population. Let me close by simply saying what the reaction of some of the mayors was to the announcement of a referendum. The reaction of mayors who are now working in good faith to try to deal with the hand that was dealt them, to come up with priorities and come up with a plan, to come up with a referendum question, so that given this government's majority and the intransigence of the Premier and her government about holding this referendum despite widespread opposition, they are working in good faith, Honourable Speaker, to try to make that a success. The Mayor of Surrey: we just really need to stop playing politics and get the job done. Mayor of Richmond, referring to the referendum: a recipe for disaster. It will divide the whole region, and if it fails, we'll be further behind than we ever were. A referendum is simply a way to avoid responsibility. The Mayor of White Rock: an absolute, utter, and total mistake and a total abrogation of responsibility. The Mayor of Port Coquitlam, who in 2005 was a BC Liberal candidate, Greg Moore: the hypocrisy of this policy platform proposal is unbelievable. The Mayor of Coquitlam: a former member on the other side of the House. We need a solution. We don't need political posturing. This from a former Liberal MLA. The Mayor of Vancouver called it ridiculous, and the Chair of the Mayor's Council, the Mayor of North Vancouver District, said it's clearly a deflection of the province's responsibility. Honourable Speaker, this was not requested by the mayors. A referendum is not a condition that is being placed on other infrastructure or transit planning or highway planning or road planning. This is a one-off. This is an ill-thought-out and arbitrary decision and condition being placed on Metro Vancouver only. Metro Vancouver is important. It's critical to the economy of British Columbia. It's not just the people of Metro who deserve to be able to move around the region. It's not just the livability of the region by getting cars off the road that's at stake. It's the economy of the whole province whose goods pass through the ports of Metro Vancouver and which pass through more slowly as a result of congestion. Honourable Speaker, we have opposed this referendum from day one. Metro Vancouver deserves better. The people of the region deserves better. The mayors and councillors in the region deserve more respect, and they deserve a government that will live up to its signed agreements. Honourable Speaker, the province deserves better because the provincial economy depends on it. Finally, Honourable Speaker, let me simply say that it's not enough to have this one referendum, which we have opposed from day one and we will continue to oppose. This legislation, this bill, Bill 23, I've already mentioned that the minister confirmed that a referendum on improvements to Translink was arbitrary. It was a one-off. It's imposed only on this region. This bill not only calls for a referendum now, it calls for perpetual referenda for any increase in funding for services, transit services, new infrastructure, increased number of buses on existing routes, any increase in service that isn't funded by the first referendum will have to go to a future referendum under this legislation. Honourable Speaker, why on earth the Transportation Minister would take a bad idea and write it into legislation in perpetuity is beyond me, but that, among other reasons, is why this side of the House will stand with the mayors and councillors of the Metro Vancouver region and oppose this legislation, oppose this referendum, and oppose future referenda because it is a bad idea, it's an unfair idea, and it will hurt the region and the economy of British Columbia, as well as the people who depend on this government for leadership that we are not seeing. Thank you very much.